The image of Napoleon Bonaparte is etched forever into our collective history. The conquering general on the white horse, the brilliant strategist at Austerlitz, the relentless emperor who redrew the map of the world. We obsess over his battle tactics, his artillery placements, and his diplomatic maneuvering. But the most dangerous, effective, and revolutionary part of his war machine wasn't his old guard or the famed cavalry charges that broke entire armies. It was his accountant. For over a decade, from the proclamation of the empire in 1804 until his final crushing defeat in 1815, Napoleon waged continuous, high-intensity continental warfare at a staggering, escalating cost. Yet, here is the stunning economic secret that most historians completely overlook. He successfully kept the French national debt from spiraling out of control, while his arch-rival Great Britain saw its national debt soar to over 200% of its gross domestic product to fund the coalitions against him. France's debt remained surprisingly, almost miraculously, low. How was this even physically possible? How do you feed, clothe, and arm the largest army Europe had ever seen, march it from Madrid to Moscow, and not bankrupt your own nation in the process? He pulled off this financial magic trick by systematically refusing to pay for his wars with French money. Instead, he engineered a ruthless economic system built entirely on externalization. He deliberately forced every defeated enemy, every unwilling ally, and every occupied territory across Europe to bear the full, crushing financial burden of the French Empire's ambition. His approach to financing conflict was a radical, calculated departure from the old, gentlemanly, aristocratic system of warfare. He shifted the cost of war from the taxpayer in Paris, whom he needed to keep pacified and productive, to the peasant, the merchant, and the prince in Vienna, Berlin, or Rome. This wasn't just conquest. It was a continent-wide protection racket disguised as imperial liberation. To truly appreciate the magnitude of this strategy, you must first understand the complete fiscal chaos Napoleon inherited when he took power. The Ancien Régime, the French monarchy of Louis XVI, had financed its endless military and colonial wars by relying heavily on borrowing at high interest rates and on a wildly inefficient, corrupt system of internal taxation. This massive, unchecked national debt, combined with the incredibly unfair tax burden placed upon the peasantry and the burgeoning merchant class, was the original economic fuel that ignited the French Revolution in 1789. The people were literally taxed into rebellion to pay for the king's wars. The revolutionary governments that followed the king only made the financial chaos significantly worse. Desperate for cash and unable to borrow from legitimate banks, they resorted to printing vast quantities of paper money, the infamous assignats. This currency was backed not by gold, but by the confiscated lands of the church. The result was predictable and catastrophic: hyperinflation. The value of the money evaporated in people's hands, trade collapsed, and the government lost all financial credibility. By the time Napoleon seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire, the national treasury was essentially empty, the nation's credit was completely worthless, and the French economy was in ruins. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, immediately understood that financial stability was not just an economic necessity. It was his greatest strategic weapon. He knew that he could not build an empire on a foundation of worthless paper. His first move, even before his grand military campaigns truly began, was a complete top-down revolution in French finance. In 1800, he founded the Banque de France, a central bank with a clear, hard mandate to manage the nation's currency and debt responsibly. This provided the state with a reliable source of credit, distinct from the political instability of the government itself. It restored public faith, not in the emperor's ideology, but in the franc itself. He stabilized the currency by tying it to a strict bimetallic standard of silver and gold, creating the famous franc germinal. This fixed, reliable currency ended the nightmarish inflation of the revolutionary years and gave France the internal economic confidence it desperately needed to build a modern industrial war base. Businessmen could finally plan for the future, knowing their money would hold its value. Then came the tax reforms. Napoleon abolished the old feudal patchwork system of tax farming, where corrupt private individuals collected taxes and skimmed a hefty profit for themselves. He replaced it with a professional, centralized bureaucracy known as the Direct Tax Administration. He created a cadaster, a massive land registry, to ensure that land taxes were assessed accurately and fairly. Tax revenues began to flow steadily and reliably into the state coffers, creating a stable, predictable floor of income. This internal reform gave France the stability to launch its wars, but the enormous escalating cost of the war itself, which accounted for nearly 3/4 of the entire state expenditure by 1813, simply could not be funded by French taxes alone. To tax the French people at the rate required to sustain the Grande Armée would have destroyed the very political stability Napoleon had just restored. That is when the imperial treasury turned its ravenous gaze outward, toward the lands of its defeated enemies. He decided that if France was to conquer Europe, Europe would have to pay for the privilege. This decision unleashed the true genius and the deep cruelty of the Napoleonic bankroll. The core doctrine of Napoleon's new economic model was brutally simple. War must feed war. This wasn't just a slogan, it was strict policy. In the past, a king might conquer a province and hope to collect taxes from it over the next 20 years to pay back the loans he took out to conquer it. Napoleon didn't have 20 years, and he didn't want loans. He wanted the cash up front. He transformed the peace treaty from a diplomatic agreement into a financial transaction, utilizing the war indemnity as his primary instrument of revenue. When the Grande Armée crushed a rival power, the subsequent peace treaty always included a demand for a massive, immediate transfer of liquid wealth. This was not reparations for damages. This was the price of survival. It was an extortion payment demanded at gunpoint. The scale of these payments is shocking even by modern standards. Consider the destruction of Prussia in 1806. After the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, the Prussian army was annihilated, and the state lay defenseless. Napoleon didn't just occupy Berlin, he emptied it. The Treaty of Tilsit and subsequent conventions imposed a financial penalty on Prussia that historians estimate totaled over 600 million francs. To put that number in perspective, the entire annual budget of the French Empire at the time was roughly 700 to 800 million francs. Napoleon extracted nearly a year's worth of his own empire's operating costs from a single, much smaller nation. He demanded this payment in gold, silver, and high-quality bills of exchange. He refused paper promises or long-term bonds. This massive injection of hard currency flowed directly from the Prussian treasury into the vaults of the Banque de France and, more importantly, into a special, secretive fund known as the Domaine Extraordinaire. This was Napoleon's personal war chest, a shadow treasury completely separate from the official state budget overseen by his ministers. The Domaine Extraordinaire is one of the most fascinating hidden gears of the Napoleonic state. It was accountable only to the emperor. He used it to pay for the secret police, to distribute bonuses to his marshals to keep them loyal, and to cover emergency military expenses without needing to raise taxes or alert the public to financial difficulties. When the official war ministry ran short of funds for uniforms or gunpowder, Napoleon would simply write a check from his slush fund of stolen European gold. This allowed him to maintain the illusion of a balanced French budget while spending furiously on war. But the indemnity was only the first layer of the extraction. The second layer was the occupation cost. Napoleon insisted that the defeated nation pay for the daily upkeep of the French troops occupying their soil until the full indemnity was settled. This was a brilliant, vicious economic pincer move. The longer a nation took to pay the massive fine, the longer they had to pay for the expensive French army sitting in their cities, eating their food and drinking their wine. In Prussia, this meant that the French army of occupation, sometimes numbering over 150,000 men, was entirely fed, clothed, and housed by the Prussian taxpayer. The French treasury in Paris didn't spend a single centime on these troops for months on end. In fact, the occupation became profitable. French commanders would often requisition more supplies than they needed and sell the surplus back to the locals or ship it to France. This system turned the French army into a self-funding nomadic city. When they moved into Austria after the Battle of Wagram in 1809, the same pattern repeated. The Treaty of Schönbrunn imposed an indemnity of 85 million francs. Napoleon originally demanded much more, but the Austrian diplomats successfully argued that if he took any more, the Austrian state would simply collapse, leaving him with nothing. He took the maximum amount the victim could bleed without dying. The economic impact on the conquered nations was devastating. To pay these massive sums, the Prussian and Austrian governments were forced to debase their own currencies, sell off crown lands, and impose crushing taxes on their own people. They were effectively stripping their own economies of capital to send it to Paris. This caused massive deflation and poverty in Central Europe, destroying local industries and wiping out the savings of the middle class. Meanwhile, in France, the economy was booming. The influx of foreign bullion kept interest rates low and the currency stable. Parisian luxury industries thrived because the emperor and his new aristocracy, flush with looted cash, were spending heavily. Napoleon had successfully created a dual economy, a parasitic core in France that fed off the rapidly withering periphery of Germany and Italy. He had achieved the impossible goal of waging total war without war taxes. But he had done so by planting the seeds of a deep, burning economic resentment that would eventually unite the entire continent against him. If the war indemnities were the headline-grabbing robberies that emptied the royal vaults, the system of requisitioning was the daily, grinding theft that emptied the peasant's barn. This was the third hidden gear of Napoleon's machine, and it represented a fundamental revolution in military logistics that changed the economic reality of warfare. In the 18th century, armies were tethered to massive, slow-moving supply depots called magazines. Generals were terrified of moving too far from their bread wagons, which made wars static and wildly expensive to maintain. Napoleon slashed this cost by making a cold calculation. His army would not carry food, it would find it. The French Army Corps were designed to be self-sufficient economic predators. They spread out over the countryside like a fan, creating a swath of destruction, often 50 miles wide. Every village they passed through was legally obligated to provide bread, meat, wine, and fodder for the horses. This wasn't considered looting by the French command. It was organized tax collection at the point of a bayonet. The local mayor would be handed a requisition order, often for impossible amounts of grain or cattle, and told that if it wasn't delivered by noon, the village would be burned. For the French treasury, this policy was a miracle. It effectively removed the single largest line item, food and fodder, from the war budget and transferred it directly to the farmers of Bavaria, Saxony, or Lombardy. It allowed the Grande Armée to move with terrifying speed, marching faster than any enemy could react, precisely because they weren't dragging thousands of slow, expensive supply wagons behind them. But for the local economy, the arrival of a French corps was indistinguishable from a plague of locusts. The economic damage went far beyond just the lost food. The French constantly seized capital assets. A farmer's horse and wagon were his capital, the tools he needed to plant next year's harvest and take it to market. When the French army needed transport, they simply took the wagons and the draft animals. This stripped the occupied territories of their logistical infrastructure, causing local trade to collapse and sparking localized famines even in fertile regions. The price of grain would skyrocket in the wake of the army, causing inflation that wiped out the urban poor in cities like Vienna or Berlin. But Napoleon demanded more than just gold and grain. He demanded the most precious economic resource a nation possesses: its young men. This was the blood tax, or impôt du sang. We often think of the Grande Armée as a French force, but by 1812, nearly half of Napoleon's soldiers were not French. They were Germans, Italians, Dutch, Poles, and Swiss, conscripted by their own client governments to fight and die for the French emperor. The economic implications of this mass conscription were staggering. The Kingdom of Italy and the states of the Confederation of the Rhine were forced to strip their own economies of their prime labor force. Hundreds of thousands of able-bodied workers were removed from the fields and workshops of Central Europe and sent to die in Spain or Russia. This was a massive drain on human capital that stunted economic growth in the vassal states for a generation. These client kingdoms were forced to pay for the equipment, training, and salaries of these regiments, only to hand them over to French command. Think about the absurdity of this arrangement for a moment. The Kingdom of Westphalia, ruled by Napoleon's brother Jerome, was essentially a purpose-built military colony. It was forced to maintain an army of 25,000 men for Napoleon's use, while simultaneously paying a massive tribute to Paris and funding the upkeep of French troops stationed on its soil. The state went bankrupt almost immediately. Jerome wrote desperate letters to Napoleon, warning that the economy was collapsing and the people were on the verge of rebellion. Napoleon's response was chillingly bureaucratic. "I do not care about your administration. I care about the money and the men." This reveals the ultimate truth of the Napoleonic system. It was not a partnership. It was a pyramid scheme of exploitation. The wealth of the periphery, Rome, Amsterdam, Hamburg, Munich, was systematically vacuumed up to support the core in Paris. Napoleon used the resources of one conquered enemy to defeat the next, constantly expanding the base of the pyramid to keep the scheme solvent. As long as he kept winning, the money kept flowing, and the French taxpayer remained relatively unburdened. But like any Ponzi scheme, it required constant expansion to survive. The moment the conquest stopped, the bills would come due, and there would be no one left to rob. Napoleon's military victories gave him control over the land, but his greatest enemy, Great Britain, still ruled the waves. He knew he could not invade England. The Royal Navy made that impossible. So, in 1806, he decided to destroy Britain financially. He launched the Continental System, effectively the world's first attempt at total economic warfare on a continental scale. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Britain was a trading nation, a nation of shopkeepers, as he dismissively called them. If he could permanently close the shop, if he could shut every port in Europe to British ships and British goods, the British economy would suffocate. Their factories would close, their banks would fail, and their government would be forced to sue for peace. This wasn't just a blockade. It was a fundamental rewriting of the economic laws of Europe. With the Berlin Decree, Napoleon declared that all commerce with the British Isles was illegal. He didn't just want to stop the flow of goods, he wanted to create a new autarkic European economy, centered entirely on Paris. He envisioned a grand empire where French industry replaced British industry, and where the rest of Europe served as a captive market for French manufacturers. It was protectionism, weaponized to the extreme. For the French industrialists in the north and east of France, this was initially a golden age. With their cheaper, better British competitors legally banned, they had a monopoly. Textile mills in Alsace and the silk weavers in Lyon saw their order books fill up. This momentary boom convinced Napoleon that his economic war was working. He believed he was building a self-sufficient continent that no longer needed the colonial goods or the credit of his enemy. But for the rest of Europe, the continental system was an unmitigated economic disaster. The great port cities that had thrived on Atlantic trade, Hamburg, Amsterdam, Bordeaux, Rotterdam, were strangled overnight. Grass literally grew in the streets of Amsterdam. The merchant classes of these cities, who had been the drivers of economic modernization, were ruined. Ships rotted at the docks, and thousands of dock workers, sailors, and clerks were thrown into destitute poverty. This created a deep structural recession in the very territories Napoleon needed to tax to fund his armies. The system ignored a basic reality of the 19th century economy. Europe was addicted to colonial goods. Sugar, coffee, tobacco, cotton, and indigo were not luxuries anymore. They were necessities for the middle and upper classes. And the British Navy controlled the oceans where these goods came from. By banning British trade, Napoleon didn't stop the demand. He simply drove it underground. He unwittingly created the most massive, sophisticated, and profitable criminal enterprise in European history: statewide smuggling. Smuggling became the patriotic duty of every non-French European. It wasn't just shady characters in dark alleys. It was major banking houses and respectable merchants running blockade runners. The tiny island of Heligoland, just off the German coast and held by the British, became the warehouse of Europe. Hundreds of ships would offload British colonial goods there, which were then smuggled onto the mainland by small fishing boats under the cover of night. British goods flowed into Europe through Salonika in the Ottoman Empire, through Russia, and through the porous coasts of Spain. The corruption was so deep that it reached the very top of the French Empire. Napoleon's own marshals and administrators were often bribed to look the other way. The uniform of the French customs officer became a symbol of hated oppression. Constantly searching homes and warehouses for English contraband. When they found it, they would burn it in public squares, bonfires of cotton and coffee, while the local population watched in sullen, angry silence. These bonfires didn't destroy British economic power. They destroyed the political legitimacy of the French Empire. The hypocrisy of the system was the final insult. The French industry, which was supposed to replace Britain, couldn't produce enough to meet demand, nor could it match the quality or price. Napoleon himself eventually had to issue special licenses, allowing French merchants to trade with Britain because he needed the tax revenue and he needed British leather for his soldiers' boots. So, while he executed German merchants for trading with London, he was quietly doing business with them himself. This double standard shattered the illusion of a united crusade against the tyrant of the seas and revealed the continental system for what it truly was: a tool of French economic imperialism designed to impoverish Europe for the benefit of Paris. The moment Napoleon was forced to commit a permanent army to enforce his economic will, his brilliant system of externalized costs began to violently unravel. Nowhere was this financial bleeding more profound, more visible, or more disastrous than in the Peninsular War? The brutal, long-running conflict in Spain and Portugal that Napoleon himself later called his Spanish ulcer. This war was not started for glory or territory in the traditional sense. It was launched for a purely economic reason, to close the coastline of Portugal, the last major gap in the continental system where British goods were still flooding in. Napoleon expected another quick, profitable campaign. He installed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, expecting to modernize the Spanish administration and, more importantly, to loot the Spanish treasury, which was famous for its influx of silver from the Americas. He anticipated a quick seizure of assets that would pay for the invasion and send a surplus back to Paris. Instead, he walked into a financial buzzsaw. The Spanish people rose up in a ferocious, decentralized rebellion that we now know as guerrilla warfare. This changed the economic calculus of the war instantly. In Austria or Prussia, the French army fought a government. Once the government surrendered, the tax collectors opened their books, and the gold flowed. In Spain, there was no central government to surrender. The French controlled the ground they stood on, and nothing else. This meant that the efficient machine of requisitioning broke down completely. You cannot systematically tax a population that is hiding in the hills, shooting your tax collectors, and burning their own crops to deny you food. The French corps, usually self-sufficient predators, suddenly became dependent on long, vulnerable supply lines stretching all the way back to France. For the first time in the history of the empire, war stopped paying for itself. The French treasury in Paris had to start sending massive convoys of gold bullion into Spain just to pay the soldiers and buy food that could not be stolen. Historians estimate that the Spanish War cost the French Empire hundreds of millions of francs a year, a direct hemorrhage of the capital that had been looted from Germany and Italy. The flow of wealth reversed. Instead of the periphery feeding the center was being bled dry to maintain a tenuous hold on the periphery. The nature of the terrain exacerbated this financial disaster. Spain was poor, arid, and mountainous compared to the fertile plains of Lombardy or the Rhineland. There was simply less surplus wealth to steal. When French commanders tried to enforce the usual brutal requisitioning policies, they didn't get food. They got an even fiercer insurgency. It was a vicious economic cycle. The more they tried to extract to cover their costs, the more the resistance grew, and the higher the costs of occupation rose. Furthermore, the British Army, led by the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal to support the resistance. Wellington understood the economic game perfectly. He practiced a scorched earth policy, destroying food stocks and transportation infrastructure as he retreated, ensuring that the pursuing French armies starved. The French lost tens of thousands of horses, crucial capital assets for transport and cavalry, simply because they couldn't find fodder in the barren Spanish landscape. Replacing these horses required purchasing them in France or Germany and transporting them hundreds of miles, an exorbitant expense that drained the emperor's secret war chest. The Spanish ulcer also destroyed the myth of the continental system's benefits. The Spanish colonies in the Americas, which had been a source of silver and raw materials for Europe, refused to recognize Joseph Bonaparte. They opened their ports to British trade instead. Napoleon's invasion effectively handed the vast markets of Latin America directly to his British rivals, boosting the British economy at the exact moment he was trying to destroy it. The invasion of Spain was an act of economic suicide. It increased French expenses, decreased French revenue, and handed a massive new market to the enemy. By 1812, Napoleon had trapped himself in a sunk-cost fallacy. He had poured so much money and blood into Spain that he felt he couldn't leave, yet staying was bankrupting his military capacity. He was keeping nearly 300,000 of his best troops tied down in a war that generated zero revenue, while he prepared for an even larger, more expensive gamble in the East. The Spanish ulcer proved that the strategy of war pays for war has a hard limit. It only works against enemies who play by the rules of conventional, symmetric warfare. Against a people willing to destroy their own economy to remain free, the ledger always ends in the red. By 1812, the logic of the French Empire had trapped Napoleon in a deadly corner. To keep his system of extraction running, he needed constant victories. To keep the continental system functioning, he needed total compliance. And the biggest violator of that system was now the Russian Empire. Tsar Alexander had opened Russian ports to neutral ships carrying British goods, effectively punching a massive hole in Napoleon's economic blockade. The decision to invade Russia was not just about ego, it was a calculated, albeit desperate, move to plug that leak and force the Tsar back into the French economic orbit. It was intended to be the final police action of the trade war. Napoleon assembled the largest army in European history up to that point. We call it the Grande Armée, but economically speaking, it was a massive floating city of over 600,000 men and 200,000 horses. The initial capital investment to equip, train, and move this force was astronomical. Napoleon emptied his secret war chest, the Domaine Extraordinaire, pouring hundreds of millions of looted francs into the preparation. He was betting everything on a quick, decisive campaign. He expected to smash the Russian army in a border battle, march to Moscow, dictate a peace treaty, and collect a war indemnity that would refill his vaults and pay for the entire operation. But the Russians refused to play their part in this economic script. They understood that they could not defeat Napoleon in a direct financial or military contest. Instead, they traded space for time. As they retreated, they employed a brutal scorched earth policy, destroying grain stores, burning bridges, and emptying villages. This was a direct attack on Napoleon's primary financing mechanism, requisitioning. When the French cavalry rode into a village expecting to find fodder and food, they found only ashes. The economic implications of this were immediate and devastating. The French army, designed to be a predator living off the land, was suddenly forced to become a logistical trucking company. They had to haul their own food from depots in Poland and Germany, stretching supply lines over hundreds of miles of bad roads. The cost of transport skyrocketed. A loaf of bread that cost a few centimes in Paris cost francs by the time it reached Smolensk, simply due to the expense of moving it. The French treasury was bleeding cash just to keep the army from starving, and they were failing. Then came the fire of Moscow. When Napoleon finally entered the Russian capital, he expected a surrender delegation and a treasury to loot. Instead, the city was set ablaze by the Russians themselves. The destruction of Moscow was a massive deletion of wealth. The palaces, the warehouses, and the winter quarters that Napoleon was banking on were gone. He sat in the Kremlin for a month, realizing that there was no government to tax, no peace treaty to sign, and no indemnity to collect. The investment had yielded a return of zero. The retreat from Russia is often remembered for the freezing cold and the human tragedy, but the economic historian sees it as the single greatest destruction of military capital in the 19th century. It wasn't just the loss of 500,000 men, which was a demographic disaster for France and her allies. It was the loss of the equipment. The French abandoned thousands of cannons, tens of thousands of wagons, and, most critically, nearly 200,000 horses. In the pre-industrial age, the horse was the engine of war. Horses pulled the artillery, carried the cavalry, and hauled the supply wagons. A trained war horse was an expensive, complex piece of military technology that took years to breed and train. Losing 200,000 of them in a few months was an economic blow from which the empire could not recover. To replace them, Napoleon had to buy low-quality horses at inflated prices from unwilling German dealers, depleting his cash reserves even further. When Napoleon crossed back into friendly territory in late 1812, his grand army was gone. He had lost the principal of his investment. The domaine extraordinaire was drained. The myth of French invincibility was shattered, which meant the credit rating of the empire collapsed. His allies in Prussia and Austria, who had been paying his bills and supplying his troops, looked at the broken French army and did the math. They realized that France could no longer enforce its debts. The fear that held the system of extortion together evaporated, and one by one they stopped paying and switched sides. The Russian campaign didn't just lose an army. It bankrupted the political economy of the Napoleonic Empire. By 1813, the war had transformed into a pure contest of economic systems. On one side stood Napoleon, desperate for cash, his plunder machine broken, trying to rebuild an army from a treasury that was rapidly emptying. On the other side stood Great Britain, wielding the most powerful weapon of the 19th century, the sovereign bond market. This is the moment where the hidden gear of credit finally crushed the gear of extraction. While Napoleon was scraping the bottom of the barrel for horses and conscripts, the British government was engaged in the largest foreign aid program the world had ever seen. It was called the subsidy system. Britain effectively hired the armies of Europe to fight France. They signed treaties with Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and eventually Austria, promising massive monthly payments in gold and silver pound sterling. In 1813 alone, Britain sent over £11 million to its continental allies. That is an astronomical sum, equivalent to funding entire national governments. This financial lifeline did two things. First, it allowed the Russians and Prussians to stay in the field after their own economies had been shattered by years of French occupation. They could buy food, weapons, and uniforms because London was paying the bills. Second, it cemented the coalition. In previous wars, Napoleon had split his enemies by offering separate peace deals that saved them money. Now, Britain made sure that fighting Napoleon was more profitable than surrendering to him. The coalition of the gold was unbreakable because it was underpinned by the Bank of England. Conversely, Napoleon faced a nightmare scenario: revenue collapse. The loss of his territories in the east meant the loss of his indemnities and requisitions. The domaine extraordinaire was empty. For the first time in his reign, he was forced to do the one thing he had promised never to do. He heavily taxed the French people to pay for a foreign war. He doubled the land tax and imposed new, hated duties on salt and tobacco. The political contract of the empire, glory abroad, low taxes at home, was shattered. The French public, previously indifferent to the wars, suddenly felt the stinging price of imperial ambition in their own wallets. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, known as the Battle of the Nations, was the military culmination of this financial shift. Napoleon was outnumbered and outgunned because he could no longer afford to match the resource output of the combined Allied powers. When he was defeated and forced to retreat back to France, he lost more than just Germany. He lost his last remaining source of external revenue. The empire shrank back to the borders of France, and the entire financial burden of the massive military state crashed down onto the domestic French economy. The invasion of France in 1814 was a grim economic reality check. The Allied armies, funded by British credit, marched into a country that was financially exhausted. Napoleon fought a brilliant defensive campaign, but he was fighting math. He had no money to pay his troops, no money to buy fodder, and no money to manufacture guns. His marshals, who had grown rich on the plunder of Europe, looked at the balance sheet and saw no future. They forced him to abdicate not just because of military defeat, but because the state was insolvent. The self-funding war had ended in national bankruptcy. The final chapter of the Napoleonic Wars, the 100 Days of 1815, serves as the ultimate case study in the economics of desperation. When Napoleon escaped from exile on Elba and returned to Paris, he didn't just face a military challenge, he faced an immediate financial crisis. The royalist government he ousted had left the treasury empty. To raise an army for the inevitable showdown at Waterloo, Napoleon had to perform financial miracles without triggering a civil war. He couldn't raise taxes again. That would have sparked a revolution. He couldn't borrow. No banker in Europe would lend to him. So he resorted to cannibalizing the state. He seized the remaining assets of the communes, demanded forced loans from wealthy officials, and suspended all non-military government spending. It was a burn the furniture to heat the house strategy. The army that marched to Waterloo was equipped on a shoestring budget, fueled by the last scraps of French capital. Opposite him, the financial machine of the coalition spun into high gear one last time. The British Parliament voted for an immediate war budget of nearly £100 million, a staggering display of financial shock and awe. They paid the Russians, the Austrians, and the Prussians to mobilize instantly. Wellington's army at Waterloo was essentially a mercenary force paid for by the City of London. The economic disparity was absolute. One side had unlimited credit, the other had empty pockets. The defeat at Waterloo was followed by a peace treaty designed to ensure France could never again afford to threaten Europe. The Treaty of Paris of 1815 was a punitive financial straitjacket. The Allies imposed a war indemnity of 700 million francs, a colossal sum intended to cripple the French state for a decade. Unlike Napoleon's chaotic extraction, this was a formalized, bureaucratized debt enforced by a coalition of international bankers. But the Allies went further. They demanded that France pay for an occupation army of 150,000 Allied soldiers to remain on French soil for up to 5 years. France was forced to pay for its own humiliation, feeding and housing the very troops that had defeated it. This was the ultimate reversal of Napoleon's war feeds war policy. The predator had become the prey. The French economy was subjected to the same requisitioning and taxation that Napoleon had inflicted on Berlin and Vienna. The legacy of this debt was profound. To pay off the indemnity and get the occupation troops out, the restored French monarchy had to embrace the very financial system Napoleon had rejected: national debt. They worked with British and Dutch bankers like the Baring brothers and the Rothschilds to issue massive sovereign bonds. These liberation loans were sold to investors across Europe. Ironically, it was the capitalist bond market, the tool of his enemy, that finally allowed France to regain its sovereignty. France paid off the debt ahead of schedule in 1818, proving that a system based on credit and trust was far more resilient than a system based on plunder and coercion. The economic history of the Napoleonic Wars leaves us with a stark, enduring lesson that resonates in every modern conflict. Extraction is finite, but credit is infinite. Napoleon proved that a state can achieve spectacular, short-term dominance by looting the wealth of its neighbors. He built an empire on the premise that war could be a profitable enterprise, a self-sustaining machine of conquest. But like a business that burns through its capital to show a profit, This model was doomed to fail the moment the expansion stopped. His hidden gears, the indemnities, the requisitions, the continental system, were mechanisms of wealth destruction, not creation. They impoverished the very territories he needed to rule, turning potential assets into liabilities and allies into insurgents. By refusing to build a sustainable system of national debt, he made his empire brittle. A single bad year, a single failed campaign in Russia, and the entire financial structure collapsed because it had no reserves, no credit, and no trust to fall back on. In contrast, Great Britain demonstrated the superpower of the future. They didn't win because they had better soldiers or braver generals. They won because they had a central bank and a bond market. They understood that the true sinews of war are not gold coins in a chest, but the confidence of the global market. By servicing their debt reliably, even in the darkest years of the war, they commanded the resources of the world. They effectively mortgaged the future to pay for victory in the present, a strategy that has defined the American military-industrial complex of the 20th and 21st centuries. Today, when we look at conflicts involving sanctions, trade wars, or occupations, we are seeing the ghosts of 1812. When a nation tries to fund a war by seizing oil fields or looting reserves, they are following the Napoleonic playbook of extraction, and they will likely face the same diminishing returns. When a coalition uses financial exclusion, asset freezes, and coordinated aid, they are using the British playbook of economic strangulation and credit warfare. The F-35s and the drones of today are the modern equivalents of the cavalry and the cannons, but the hidden gears haven't changed. The side that can maintain its credit rating, manage its inflation, and keep its economy integrated with the world will always have the long-term advantage over the side that retreats into autarky and plunder. Napoleon was a genius on the battlefield, but he was an amateur in the bank. And in the end, the bank always wins. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the financial machinery of the Napoleonic Empire, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We're going to be breaking down the economics of the American Civil War next, a conflict where inflation, cotton, and blockades decided the fate of a nation. You don't want to miss it. I'm Hidden Gears, and remember, history is written by the victors, but it's funded by the accountants.